What does justice and injustice look like in our country? It can mean many things to many people, depending on who they are, where they live, and their place in history. So when youth from the Fourth Presbyterian Church and the Chicago Lights Tutoring Program set out on a 9-day justice journey through the South, they didn't quite know what to expect, but they learned a lot along the way. Let's welcome 3 of the Justice Journey travelers. Shelley Donaldson is Senior High and Confirmation Coordinator at Fourth Presbyterian Church. Ananda Barkley is a church member and one of the adult leaders on the journey. And Grace Turner is a member of Fourth Presbyterian Church and a sophomore at Walter Payton High School. And welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being on Different Drummers.
Thank you for having us.
Shelley, let's start with you. Why a justice journey, and how is it different from other kinds of mission trips?
So the point of this trip was to actually have a much stronger learning component to it. It was less about going out and doing some sort of a specific project, and it was more about understanding the role that the church played in the history of the civil rights movement, and also how various communities were affected by the civil rights movement and the roles that they played in it. We started our trip down in Cairo, Illinois, southern tip of Illinois, and then we went down into Memphis, Tennessee, where we stayed with a local church down there, and we went to the Civil Rights Museum down there with the Lorraine Motel. And so the kids got to see that and sort of see some of the history that was there. It's a wonderful motel. It's a wonderful space. And so after that, we moved on to Alabama. We went through Mississippi and went down into Alabama to Montgomery and Selma and Birmingham. We walked the trip down in Selma. What you see, for instance, in the movie Selma, we walked from that chapel, Brown Chapel, all the way across the bridge. And they have a small sort of tourist kind of museum down there, and we stopped there. And then when we got into Birmingham, we also visited the Civil Rights Museum that was there, right across the street from the 16th Street Baptist Church that was bombed. And then also there was a park just adjacent to that where a lot of various rallies were held and people would meet up to start marches or that sort of thing. And then after that, we went to Atlanta, where we added in our service component with Door Atlanta, and we stayed at Central Presbyterian Church.
Ananda, you were one of the leaders on the trip. Tell us about the youth on the trip.
We had 50 youth in total. About 6 or so were not from Fourth Pres, they're from Chicago Lights, our tutoring program. That brought a great dynamic, I feel like, in terms of Chicago Lights got to experience Selma in a different way, or just the South in general. And our youth from Fourth also got to experience in a different way. They got to share how that affected each other, which I think is very, very important. And one of the things that we stressed on the trip was that this is all of our history. I think so often we're told this is just Black history or African American history, but in reality it's all of our history. And so how does that affect us all since we're in relationship?
Grace, you were one of those on the trip.
Yes.
Yeah, was that your first trip to the South?
It was the first time I've been there.
What were some of the highlights of the trip from your experience?
Well, what I thought was one of the most moving historical places we saw was the 16th Street Baptist Church, where it was seen in the movie Selma as well, where was it 4 girls? They were in it and somebody had bombed it while they were in it, and it was a really sad and moving memorial that we got to see that and see a museum centered around that. When another highlight of the trip was when we were working with Door Atlanta. I was helping a church, helping out at a church. Like they were serving lunch and breakfast for people experiencing homelessness, and I was helping to serve that and to make the meals. And we became friends with the cook there, and then later that night we saw the same cook that had become such a great friend with us on the street outside the church amongst all the other people experiencing homelessness, and that was really moving to see that anybody could experience that. Mm-hmm. it doesn't matter what background you come from.
And does that make a difference to how you see people on the street here in Chicago?
Very, very big. Almost all of my stereotypes of anything were shattered on that trip.
Was it more powerful to actually see those places in person with your own eyes?
Extremely. I guess you can read about anything in a textbook and memorize the facts and the dates, and even read like journals and all that, but it's never the same as seeing that this actually happened to somebody that was very similar to who I am, and this is a very real thing.
Ananda, what were some of the highlights of the trip for you?
I think one of the biggest highlights was crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I'd never been to Selma, Alabama. I've been to the King Center in Atlanta, but that was really huge. It was moving for me. I really don't have words to. There are no words.
I really wanted the kids to get something out of this, and I wanted the leaders that went on this trip to really see the civil rights movement outside of something that was just in the movies, but something that truly happened and that is still affecting us to this day. Some of these issues are still happening that they were fighting for, and so I wanted the kids and the leaders to really be able to see that, and for us to talk to people on the ground maybe that were part of that, or that had real strong historical ties to those movements. For me, the greatest part was actually when we were in Atlanta. We arrived the first night and we were doing our intake with Dorr, and they were sort of doing a little check-in with us. And I was sitting to the side going through my paperwork, logistics and that thing. And the leader asked what was one thing that had surprised our youth so far on this trip. And we had already done most of the learning piece. And so as I was sitting there going through my paperwork, one after one, I would hear the youth talk about something really important that just like changed their core of who they were, of how they were surprised that the church was so heavily involved in some areas, or that the church took a stand, or they were surprised at learning something that they had never heard in a museum or just from talking to somebody. And so truly the greatest part of the trip for me was when we were coming home and hearing the stories of the kids who said, I didn't know that. I've never heard that part of the civil rights story. I didn't know about slave boats. I didn't know about some of these things. And so to be able to help bring that, to help be a part of that, was really, truly the greatest part of it for me.
Mm-hmm. Grace, it was a lot of history, right? A lot of museums
Yes.
and learning about things that happened kind of a long time ago. Not all that long, actually, in the great span of things. But do you see a connection with what happened then to what's happening now in the world?
Yeah, there's a lot of media on all the shootings and things that have been going on in the past few years. But this trip really helped me realize that our society today is not like colorblind as most people like to say it. Chicago's still very segregated, and there's such a separation between any people of any demographics that it's really sad to see, and it really opened my eyes to it.
I think it was really important for the kids to understand that the civil rights movement, while we study it as sort of an era in schools or in our history classes, that it's not necessarily something that has ended. There are still so many people that are fighting for basic civil rights on so many levels. And coming from a more wealthy church like we do, we're the big church in downtown, a lot of people know who we are. We do have a responsibility to get out there and to be a part of this.
Well, thank you, Shelley, Ananda, and Grace, for sharing your journey with us. I'm Jan Engmeyer for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.